Working the overnight shift at Walmart isn't exactly thrilling, but it had its perks. No crowds, no long checkout lines, and the quiet hum of the store at night made the time go by quickly. I had been working there for a few months, mostly stocking shelves in the grocery section. I liked the solitude, the way the store felt almost abandoned in the late hours, like a forgotten place existing in its own world between midnight and sunrise. But that night, I learned something about Walmart I wish I hadn't. Because when you're alone in a giant store in the middle of the night, you aren't really alone. It started with a noise, a dull thud echoing from the back of the store near the stockroom. At first, I thought it was just one of my coworkers dropping a box or maybe a rat knocking something over. The stockroom was massive, lined with towering shelves filled with products waiting to be put on display. It wasn't uncommon to hear a weird sound every now and then, but something about this noise made me pause. It didn't sound like something falling. It sounded intentional. I shook it off and went back to work, stacking cans onto the shelf. The store was mostly quiet, aside from the occasional crackle of the intercom and the faint beeping of the registers at the self-checkout area. Then, I heard it again. A slow, dragging sound, like something was being pulled across the floor. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. That sound hadn't come from the store floor. It had come from inside the stockroom. I grabbed my radio and clicked it on. "Hey, anyone in the back?" I asked. Silence. I waited a few seconds before trying again. "Chris? Taylor? You guys back there?" Still nothing. I felt a shiver creep up my spine. There were only 3 of us scheduled that night, and I knew for a fact that Chris and Taylor were up front, handling checkout, which meant no one else was supposed to be in the stockroom. I hesitated before heading toward the double doors that led to the back. I told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe the noise had come from outside, or maybe one of my coworkers had slipped back there without me noticing. But deep down, something felt wrong. As I stepped inside the stockroom, the air immediately felt colder. The space was dimly lit by overhead lights, casting long, eerie shadows between the tall shelving units. The rows of boxes stretched far into the back, creating narrow aisles that disappeared into the darkness. I took a few cautious steps forward, my footsteps echoing in the silence. "Hello?" I called out. Nothing. Just the hum of the ventilation system and the faint buzzing of the fluorescent lights. I was about to turn around when I saw it. A figure at the far end of the stockroom. It was just standing there, perfectly still. At first, I thought it was a mannequin. We sometimes had promotional displays stored in the back, lifeless figures waiting to be set up in the aisles. But as I squinted through the dim light, I realized something that made my stomach drop. It was facing the wall, not leaning against it, not looking at a shelf, just standing, completely still. And then, it moved. A slow, unnatural shift, as if it had just become aware that I was there. I took a step back, my heart hammering. "Hey man," I called out, trying to sound casual. "You're not supposed to be back here." No response. No movement. Just that awful, eerie stillness. I swallowed hard and reached for my radio again. "Chris, Taylor, can one of you come back here?" Static. Then, a faint click, like someone had picked up their radio but wasn't speaking. A few seconds passed before a voice finally came through. But it wasn't Chris or Taylor. It wasn't anyone I recognized. Just a low, whispering breath. "You shouldn't be here." I dropped the radio. It hit the floor with a sharp clatter, the sound bouncing off the metal shelves. And that's when the figure turned around. I don't know what I expected to see. A security guard? A lost customer? Maybe even some homeless guy who had wandered in through an unlocked door? But the thing that faced me wasn't right. It was tall. Too tall. Its limbs were thin, stretched unnaturally, like its bones had been pulled into something they weren't meant to be. Its face was wrong. No eyes. No mouth. Just a smooth, empty surface, like someone had wiped away all its features. And even though it had no eyes, I knew it was staring right at me. I felt paralyzed, like something was pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. Then, it stepped forward. A slow, jerky movement, like it wasn't used to walking. That broke me. I ran. I sprinted toward the double doors, my shoes slamming against the tile floor. I didn't stop, didn't look back. I just kept running. I crashed through the doors and into the store, gasping for air. The bright lights felt blinding compared to the dim stockroom, but I didn't care. Chris and Taylor were both at the front, ringing up a customer. They looked up at me in confusion. "Dude," Chris said, "you okay?" I turned back toward the stockroom doors, expecting to see it standing there. But the doors were still, closed, like nothing had happened. I tried explaining what I saw, but they just laughed it off. "Man, you need a break," Taylor said. "Too much caffeine or something." I knew they wouldn't believe me. Hell, I barely believed myself. But I wasn't going back there. Not alone. I spent the rest of my shift stocking the front shelves, keeping my back to the wall, my ears straining for any sound from the back. But nothing came. And when my shift finally ended, I left without clocking out. The next morning, I got a call from my manager. Security cameras had picked up something strange. In the footage, I was alone in the stockroom, talking to no one. And when I ran out, the cameras glitched for exactly 7 seconds. 7 seconds of pure static, like something had been there, but didn't want to be seen. It started as a quick run to the local superstore. I was grabbing a few things late at night after work, hoping to avoid the crowds. The store was unusually quiet, the kind of stillness you don't expect in a place like that. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, the occasional squeak of a shopping cart echoing faintly in the distance. I'd parked near the entrance, as I always did, under the dim glow of one of the few working street lamps in the lot. I didn't think much about my surroundings. I had done this countless times before, but this time was different. As I left the store, balancing my bags in one hand and my keys in the other, I noticed him. A man stood near the edge of the parking lot, leaning heavily on a crutch. He was illuminated by the flickering street lamp above, his figure distorted by the shadow it cast on the pavement. His head was down, and he seemed to be struggling, wobbling slightly as though the crutch wasn't enough to steady him. Normally, I would have kept walking. I wasn't one to involve myself in situations like this, but something about the way he stood there, clearly struggling, pulled at my conscience. "Excuse me," I called out, my voice hesitant. "Are you okay?" He lifted his head slowly, and for a moment, I saw his face. It was gaunt, with sharp cheekbones and hollow eyes that seemed to glint unnaturally in the dim light. But his expression wasn't threatening. If anything, he looked relieved. "Oh, thank you," he said, his voice raspy. I didn't think anyone would stop. I hesitated. Something felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. "Do you need help?" He nodded and gestured toward the far end of the parking lot. "My car's over there. I dropped something, and I can't pick it up. If you could just help me grab it." The smart thing to do would have been to walk away, but I didn't. I followed him as he hobbled toward the dark edge of the lot, where the streetlights gave way to shadows. His movement seemed awkward and unnatural, the crutch digging into the asphalt with each step. "Is this your car?" I asked, eyeing the beat-up sedan parked at an odd angle near the edge of the lot. "Yes, thank you," he said, leaning heavily on the crutch as he pointed toward the ground near the passenger side. "It's just over there. I can't bend down to get it." I sighed, setting my bags down on the hood of the car. "What am I looking for?" He didn't answer. That's when I felt it, a presence behind me. Before I could react, an arm clamped around my neck, yanking me backward. My heart surged with panic as I struggled, kicking and flailing against the grip of someone much stronger than me. The man with the crutch dropped it, standing upright as if he had never needed it in the first place. His hollow eyes were now filled with something sinister, and he was grinning. "Got him," he said to my attacker. I twisted violently, trying to free myself, but the arm around my neck only tightened. I couldn't breathe. "Relax," a voice hissed in my ear. "We just want to talk." But I knew better. In a surge of adrenaline, I threw my head back, slamming it into the face of the man holding me. He let out a grunt of pain, and his grip loosened just enough for me to break free. I stumbled forward, gasping for air, and spun around to face them. There were two of them. The man with the crutch, now standing tall and smirking, and the one who had grabbed me, clutching his nose as blood trickled down his face. "What do you want?" I demanded, my voice shaking. They didn't answer. The man with the crutch took a step forward, his grin widening. "You shouldn't have stopped," he said. I turned and ran. My car wasn't far, but it felt like miles as I sprinted across the parking lot, my heart pounding in my ears. Behind me, I could hear their footsteps, heavy, fast, and getting closer. I fumbled with my keys as I reached my car, my hands trembling so badly that I dropped them. Swearing under my breath, I crouched down, frantically searching the ground. Going somewhere? I looked up to see the man with the crutch standing over me, his eyes gleaming with malice. I didn't think. I grabbed the only thing within reach, my bags of groceries, and swung them at him with all my might. The impact knocked him off balance, and he stumbled backward, giving me just enough time to snatch up my keys and unlock the car door. I threw myself into the driver's seat and slammed the door shut, locking it as the second man lunged for the handle. He pounded on the window, shouting obscenities, but I didn't wait to hear what he had to say. I started the car and hit the gas, the tires screeching as I sped out of the lot. In the rearview mirror, I saw them standing there, their figures growing smaller and smaller as I put distance between us. But just as I thought I was safe, something glinted in the mirror. A third figure, standing at the far end of the lot, just beyond the glow of the streetlights. They weren't running, weren't shouting, just watching. And as I turned onto the main road, my heart still racing, I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't escaped at all, that somewhere, somehow, they were still following me. That night, I learned a lesson I'll never forget. Sometimes, the people who seem to need help the most are the ones you should be running from. I've worked at a lot of different places over the years, but this job was one of the easiest. It was a quiet Walmart in a small town, and most nights were uneventful. People came in, grabbed their groceries, and left. No drama, no big crowds, just a few late-night shoppers stocking up before heading home. I liked working nights because it was slow, but that also meant I was often alone in certain parts of the store. And that night, I wished I hadn't been. It was almost midnight when he walked in. I was in aisle 7, restocking some canned goods when I heard the door sensors beep from the front of the store. Normally, I wouldn't have paid much attention, but something about the way the air seemed to change made me uneasy. Then I saw him, a man in a black ski mask. At first, I thought maybe it was just cold outside, that he had forgotten to take it off. But the longer I watched him from the corner of my eye, the more I realized something was off. He wasn't browsing like a normal customer. He walked straight to the canned goods aisle, the aisle I was in, and stopped right at the other end. I pretended to be busy stacking cans, but I could feel him standing there, watching. Then, after a long pause, he spoke. "You got beans?" His voice was flat, almost robotic, like he was trying too hard to sound normal. I hesitated. Yeah, they're right here." I gestured to the shelf. "What kind are you looking for?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he just stood there, his head tilted slightly, as if he was studying me. Then, finally, he walked closer, too close, and reached for a can of baked beans. His hand hovered over the shelf for an uncomfortable amount of time before he finally grabbed one and held it up. "These are good," he said. I forced a chuckle. "Yeah, I guess so." He didn't move, didn't put the can in a basket, just held it, turning it over in his hands like it was the most interesting thing in the world. And then, just as suddenly as he had spoken, he turned and walked away. I let out a slow breath, trying to shake the tension. It wasn't unusual for weird people to come in late at night, but something about him didn't feel right. I went back to work, trying to push it from my mind. A few minutes later, I saw him again. This time, he was standing in the next aisle over, just out of sight except for the corner of his jacket peeking from around the shelf. He wasn't moving, wasn't grabbing anything, just standing there, watching me. A chill crept up my spine. I cleared my throat, pretending not to notice, and moved to another aisle. Then I heard soft footsteps behind me. I glanced over my shoulder, and there he was, still holding the same can of beans. My pulse quickened. I forced a polite smile. "Can I help you find something else?" He tilted his head. "No." Another long pause. Then he turned and walked toward the front of the store. I stood there for a moment, my heart hammering in my chest. I waited for the sound of the register, for the automatic doors to beep as he left, but they never did. I peeked toward the front of the store. The cashier was gone, probably in the back taking inventory. And the man in the ski mask? He was standing by the exit, still holding the can of beans, still watching me. I had had enough. I walked toward the back, pretending to grab something from storage, and waited. A few minutes passed. Then, finally, the doors beeped. I exhaled, relieved. He was gone, or so I thought. My shift ended at 2 a.m. By then, I had shaken off the weird encounter, convincing myself it had been just another strange customer. But when I stepped outside into the cold night air, I froze. Because sitting there, right outside the entrance on the sidewalk, was a can of beans. The same brand, the same exact can, carefully placed right in the center of the pavement, like he had left it there for me. I looked around, scanning the parking lot, the shadows near the street lamps, the rows of empty cars. Nothing. No sign of him. Just the can of beans sitting there, waiting. A chill ran through me. I wasn't about to stick around to see if he was watching. I hurried to my car, locking the doors as soon as I got in. I started the engine, but before I drove off, I stole one last glance at the entrance. The can of beans was gone. I didn't sleep well that night. The next day, I told my manager about what had happened. He shrugged it off, said late-night weirdos came in all the time. Unless he stole something or caused a problem, we can't do anything about it, he said. I wanted to forget about it. I really did. But that night, when I got home from another shift, I found something waiting on my doorstep. A single can of beans. I stood there, my breath catching in my throat. I hadn't told anyone where I lived. No one had followed me home. So how did he know? I grabbed the can, my hands shaking, and turned it over. On the bottom, scrawled in black marker, were 4 words. See you again soon. That was the last shift I ever worked at that store. I quit the next day. I never saw the man in the ski mask again. But even now, years later, every time I walk into a grocery store, I find myself glancing at the canned goods aisle, and whenever I see a can of beans sitting alone on a shelf, I wonder, is he still out there, watching? It started out as a typical shift at work. I was on the evening schedule at a big box retail store, clocking in as usual and preparing for another long night of managing the checkout line. The store always had its share of interesting customers, from families with carts piled high to night owls grabbing last-minute items. I had grown used to the rhythm, polite smiles, small talk, and the endless beeping of the scanner. But that night, someone new walked in, and everything changed. It was about 9 p.m. when I first noticed him. He came through my line holding just a single item, a can of soda. He was tall, probably in his mid-30s, with messy hair and a jacket that looked like it had seen better days. He didn't say much at first, just handed me the can and stared at me with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. I smiled politely, as I always did. Is that all for you tonight? He nodded, then paused, as if considering something. You've got a nice smile, he said suddenly. The comment caught me off guard. Customers complimented us sometimes, but there was something about the way he said it. His tone, the way his eyes lingered just a little too long, that made my skin crawl. Thanks, I replied quickly, scanning the soda and handing it back to him. Have a good night. But he didn't leave right away. He stood there for a moment, watching me, and then, without another word, he walked off into the store. I didn't think much of it at first. People could be weird, and I had plenty of other customers to deal with. But a few minutes later, he came back, this time with a bag of chips. Hi again, he said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Hello, I replied, scanning his item. Is that everything? Just wanted to see your smile again, he said. I forced a laugh, trying to keep things professional, but inside, I was starting to feel uneasy. I handed him his bag and watched as he walked away, disappearing down one of the aisles. Over the next hour, he came through my line 4 more times, each time with a single item. A candy bar, a bottle of water, a pack of gum. By the 4th visit, I was actively avoiding eye contact, hoping he would take the hint. But he didn't. Each time, he made a comment, about my smile, about my hair, about how nice I was. He asked if I was single, if I lived nearby, if I liked working nights. I gave short, polite answers, hoping he would stop. But he didn't. By the time my shift was winding down, I was relieved to see that he had finally left. The store was quiet, the last few customers trickling out as we prepared to close. I clocked out just after 11 p.m., grabbing my jacket and bag from the break room. As I headed toward the parking lot, I kept my head down, scanning my phone and thinking about how nice it would be to finally be home. But as I reached my car, I saw him. He was leaning against a nearby lamppost, his jacket zipped up against the cool night air. My stomach sank. "Hey there," he called out as I approached my car. I ignored him, fumbling with my keys. "Hey," he said again, stepping closer. "Wait up. I just want to talk." I turned to face him, trying to keep my voice steady. "Look, I'm tired. I just want to go home." He smiled, but there was something unsettling about it. "I get that, but I thought maybe we could hang out sometime. You're really nice. I like talking to you." "I'm sorry," I said, forcing a polite tone. "I'm not interested." His smile faded. "Why not?" he asked, his voice a little sharper now. "I've been nice to you all night." I felt a knot of fear tighten in my chest. "I just want to go home," I repeated, unlocking my car door and climbing inside. As I shut the door and locked it, he stepped closer, placing a hand on the window. "Come on," he said, his voice muffled through the glass. "Just give me a chance." I shook my head, starting the engine. His face darkened. "Fine," he muttered, stepping back. "I'll see you around." I didn't wait to see what he meant by that. I drove home as fast as I could, constantly checking my mirrors to make sure he wasn't following me. When I finally pulled into my apartment complex, I parked and sat in my car for a few minutes, trying to calm my racing heart. The parking lot was quiet, the streetlights casting long shadows across the pavement. I didn't see anyone nearby, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I grabbed my bag and hurried inside, locking the door behind me. But as I turned off the lights and climbed into bed, I couldn't shake the unease that had settled over me. The next morning, I found a note taped to my door. It was scrawled in messy handwriting. "You didn't have to be rude." My heart sank. I called the police, explaining everything that had happened. They came to my apartment, took my statement, and assured me they would patrol the area. But the fear didn't go away. For the next few days, I was on edge, jumping at every sound, every shadow. I avoided going out unless absolutely necessary, and when I did, I was constantly looking over my shoulder. A week later, I got a call from the police. They had found the man loitering near my apartment complex and had taken him in for questioning. I don't know what they said to him, but I never saw him again after that. To this day, I can't walk to my car at night without thinking about that night, about the way he watched me, the way his tone changed when I told him no. It's a reminder that sometimes being polite isn't enough, and sometimes the people who seem the nicest are the ones you need to fear the most. Late-night grocery runs were something I did often. There was something about the emptiness of the aisles, the quiet hum of the fluorescent lights, and the absence of daytime chaos that made the experience almost peaceful. I could take my time, browse without feeling rushed, and get in and out without the hassle of long lines. That night, I was only planning to grab a few essentials: milk, eggs, bread, the usual. I parked near the front of the nearly deserted Walmart lot, choosing a space close to the entrance beneath one of the dim streetlights. I stepped out into the cool night air, locking my car behind me as I walked inside. I had no idea that by the time I left, I wouldn't be alone. I took my time shopping, wandering through the nearly empty store, enjoying the solitude. A few employees were restocking shelves, and I passed one or two other late-night shoppers, but for the most part, the place was dead. The speakers played soft, outdated pop songs, blending with the occasional beep of a scanner from the self-checkout area. After about 20 minutes, I had everything I needed. As I made my way to the registers, I noticed a man lingering near the entrance. He wasn't a customer. He had no cart, no basket, no items in his hands. He was just standing there, watching people leave. I tried not to stare, but something about him made my stomach tighten. He was dressed in an old hoodie, the hood pulled up just enough to cast a shadow over his face. His jeans were worn, the fabric slightly frayed at the bottom, and his shoes looked scuffed and dirty, like he'd been walking for miles. I scanned my groceries as quickly as I could, keeping him in my peripheral vision. He didn't move. He didn't look at his phone, didn't pretend to browse through the cheap keychains and candy bars near the exit like someone waiting for a ride. He just stood there, waiting. I swallowed hard and grabbed my bags. Maybe he was just loitering. Maybe he was homeless and hoping someone would offer him some spare change. I tried to push the unease down as I walked toward the doors. As soon as I stepped outside, the air felt different. It was colder than before, and the parking lot, though mostly empty, suddenly seemed too quiet. I quickened my pace, my car only a few spaces away. Then I heard it. "Hey, man." I flinched, stopping mid-step. The man from inside had followed me out. He was closer now, standing near the row of shopping carts a few feet from my car. "Hey, sorry to bother you," he said, his voice oddly casual. "But my car won't start. I think my battery's dead." I hesitated, my hand gripping my grocery bag a little tighter. I glanced around the lot. No other people, no security, just the distant hum of traffic from the highway. I forced a polite smile. "Sorry, man. I don't have jumper cables." He nodded, shifting his weight slightly. "That's all right. You mind giving me a lift? My buddy's house is just a couple miles down the road." My stomach tightened. There it was. The request that shouldn't have come. I took a slow step back. "Sorry, I can't." His smile faded, just for a second. Then, as if flipping a switch, he grinned again. Wide, unnatural. "Come on, man. Just a quick ride." He took a step forward. I took another step back. My hand tightened around my keys. "No," I said, firmer this time. The grin disappeared. His whole posture changed, shoulders squaring, hands shifting in his hoodie pockets. He stared at me for a long moment, as if deciding something. Then, slowly, too slowly, he nodded. "All right," he muttered, turning away. I didn't wait. I hurried to my car, unlocked the door, and slammed it shut. My fingers fumbled with the ignition, my heart pounding as I locked the doors. Then, the passenger door opened. For a split second, my brain refused to process what was happening. The man, he was inside my car, sitting in the passenger seat like he had been there all along. His grin was back, wider than before, his hands resting calmly in his lap. "You sure you can't give me a ride?" he asked, voice eerily even. I couldn't breathe. How? I had locked the doors. I was sure of it. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my body was frozen. His eyes didn't blink. His smile didn't move. We sat there, locked in silence, the only sound my own pulse hammering in my ears. Then, slowly, he raised his hand and tapped my dashboard, just once. A slow, deliberate motion, like he was testing something, like he was claiming something. That was enough. I threw the car into reverse, my tires screeching against the pavement as I yanked the wheel hard, barely avoiding the parked carts. The man didn't react, didn't grab me. He just sat there, calmly, as I slammed the car into drive and sped across the lot. The force of the turn should have thrown him off balance. It didn't. He didn't move at all. Just sat there, his hands still in his lap, his grin still plastered on his face. Like he wasn't actually sitting there, like he was just a part of the car now. I drove for miles before pulling over at a gas station, my whole body shaking. I checked the car, the back seat, the parking lot. Nothing. No sign of him. No footprints. Just the lingering feeling that something had crawled inside my skin and never fully left. I didn't go back to that Walmart. Didn't tell anyone, either. Because what would I say? That some man appeared in my locked car? That he vanished without a trace? No one would believe me. I barely believed it myself. But sometimes, when I drive alone at night, I still feel it. That unnatural stillness in the passenger seat. That grin at the edge of my vision. And I wonder, did I get away? Or did he just decide to wait? It started as an ordinary grocery run. I had just finished work, and decided to stop at a nearby store to pick up a few items for dinner. The sun had already set, and the store's parking lot was mostly empty, save for a few scattered cars. Inside, the store was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes the fluorescent lights seem unnaturally bright. I grabbed a basket and made my way down the aisles, lost in thought as I moved from shelf to shelf. It wasn't until I turned into the produce section that I first noticed her. She was standing at the end of the aisle, looking at me. At first, I thought nothing of it. People glance at each other all the time in stores. I moved on, grabbing some apples and heading toward the dairy section. But as I reached for a carton of milk, I saw her again, closer this time. She was pretending to examine a display of yogurts, but her eyes kept flicking toward me, watching me out of the corner of her vision. Something about her felt off. She was dressed normally, jeans, a jacket, but she had this stillness about her, like she was too focused, too deliberate in her movements. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe she just happened to need the same items I did. But then it happened again. I moved to the frozen foods aisle, grabbing a bag of vegetables, and there she was, standing at the opposite end, her cart empty. She wasn't even pretending to look at anything now. She was just standing there, staring at me. My pulse quickened. I tried to ignore her, acting like I hadn't noticed, and moved to another aisle. I walked quickly, zigzagging through the store, hoping to lose her. But no matter where I went, she was there. Always at the edge of my vision, always watching. By the time I reached the checkout, my nerves were shot. I placed my items on the conveyor belt, glancing over my shoulder every few seconds. I didn't see her anymore, which should have been a relief. But somehow, the absence of her presence felt worse. I paid for my groceries, grabbed my bags, and headed out into the parking lot. The air was cold, and the lot was eerily quiet, the few remaining cars casting long shadows under the streetlights. I hurried to my car, unlocking it and throwing my bags into the back seat. That's when I saw her again. She was standing at the far end of the lot, partially hidden behind a parked SUV. Her head was tilted slightly, as though she was trying to decide whether to approach. My chest tightened. I climbed into my car and locked the doors, my hands trembling as I fumbled to start the engine. As I pulled out of the parking space, I glanced in the rearview mirror. She was walking toward me. I drove out of the lot, trying to convince myself that it was over. Maybe she had just been heading to her car. Maybe it was all in my head. But when I turned onto the main road, I noticed headlights in my mirror. A car was following me. I told myself it was just a coincidence. The road was a main thoroughfare. Lots of people would be heading this way. But no matter how many turns I took, no matter how many streets I veered onto, the car stayed with me. It kept its distance at first, far enough back that I couldn't make out the driver. But as I neared my neighborhood, it started creeping closer. By the time I reached my street, the car was right behind me. My stomach sank. I didn't want to pull into my driveway and let them see where I lived. So I drove past my house, turning onto another street. The car followed. I took another turn. So did they. My pulse was racing now. I reached for my phone, dialing 911 with one hand, while keeping the other on the wheel. 911. What's your emergency? Someone's following me, I said, my voice trembling. I don't know who they are, but they've been tailing me for miles. Are you in a vehicle? Yes. I'm driving through my neighborhood. I don't know what to do. Keep driving, the operator instructed. Do not stop. We'll send a patrol car to your location. Can you describe the vehicle? I glanced in the mirror. It was a dark sedan, its headlights glaring in my rear view. It's a black car, I said. I can't see the driver. The operator stayed on the line with me, guiding me as I drove in circles around the neighborhood, trying to buy time until help arrived. The car followed me at every turn, its headlights unwavering, its driver silent. Then, after what felt like an eternity, I saw the flash of blue and red lights in the distance. The patrol car pulled up behind the sedan, its siren wailing. The sedan hesitated for a moment before speeding off, disappearing down a side street. I pulled over, my hands shaking as I rolled down the window to speak with the officer. Are you okay? He asked. I think so, I said, my voice unsteady. Whoever that was, they've been following me since I left the store. We'll do a sweep of the area, the officer said. Do you want us to escort you home? I nodded, too rattled to argue. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The officers stayed until I was safely inside, promising to patrol the neighborhood throughout the night. But even with the doors locked and the lights on, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I checked the windows constantly, half expecting to see that dark sedan idling outside. It never came back. But to this day, I can't go grocery shopping without looking over my shoulder, scanning every aisle for faces that linger too long, because you never know who might be following you. I never thought much about Walmart. It was just another store, a place where I could grab groceries, cheap clothes, or whatever I needed at the time. Nothing about it ever seemed eerie or threatening. But now, every time I walk into a store, I can't help but scan the aisles, looking, listening, remembering. Because that night, I learned that horror doesn't always lurk in dark alleyways or abandoned buildings. Sometimes, it waits in the toy aisle of your local superstore. It was late, probably around 9:30 p.m., when I stopped at Walmart after work. I was exhausted, just wanting to pick up a few things before heading home. The store was mostly empty, just a handful of other shoppers and a few tired-looking employees stocking shelves. As I wandered through the aisles, I heard the occasional crackle of the intercom, the distant beeping of a checkout scanner, the low hum of the fluorescent lights above. It was quiet, peaceful in a way, until I walked past the toy section. That's when I heard it. A man's voice. Low, slow, almost too calm. "You like that doll, huh? She's real pretty." I paused. There was something off about the way he said it. It wasn't the kind of playful, amused tone that most adults use when talking to kids. There was no warmth in his voice, no familiarity, just something unnatural. Curious, I stepped closer, pretending to look at the shelves. That's when I saw them. A little girl, maybe 6 or 7, stood near the doll section, holding a Barbie in her small hands. She had long brown hair, tied up in pigtails, and was wearing a bright pink coat. And standing beside her was a man I didn't recognize. Something about him made my skin crawl. He was tall and lanky, with a wiry frame, dressed in faded jeans and an oversized black hoodie. His face was partially shadowed by the hood, but I could see enough. His eyes never left the girl. I watched as he crouched down beside her, lowering his voice. "You want to see something cool? I have a doll in my car that looks just like that one." My heart stopped. The little girl didn't answer. She just stared at the doll in her hands, her fingers gripping it tighter. She knew something was wrong. My body tensed. I looked around, scanning for a parent, anyone who might be with her. But there was no one nearby. The toy aisle was empty except for the 3 of us. And that's when the man took a step closer. He reached out, resting his hand lightly on the girl's shoulder. "Your mommy said it's okay," he murmured. "Come with me, and I'll show you." I stepped forward immediately. "Hey," I said, keeping my voice casual, trying not to startle the girl. "Are you lost, sweetie?" The girl's head snapped up toward me, her eyes wide with fear. The man straightened slowly, his expression completely blank. "She's fine," he said, his voice even. I forced a smile, though my heart was pounding. "Oh, good. I just wanted to make sure her parents were close by." There was a long, tense pause. Then the man chuckled, shaking his head. "You should mind your own business." But I wasn't about to walk away. I glanced down at the little girl. "Where's your mom, sweetheart?" She opened her mouth, hesitated, then whispered, "I don't know." That was all I needed to hear. I turned toward the front of the store. "Let's go find her." I expected the man to say something, to protest, to grab her, but instead, he just smiled. A slow, creeping grin that made my stomach twist. "All right," he murmured. "We'll see each other again." And then, just like that, he turned and walked away. I didn't wait to watch where he went. I grabbed the little girl's hand and hurried to the front of the store, scanning the area for employees. It didn't take long to find her mother, a woman in a frantic panic, pacing near customer service, her face pale with worry. The moment she saw her daughter, she broke down sobbing. She had only turned away for a minute, just a single minute to grab something off a shelf. And when she looked back, her daughter was gone. She had been searching everywhere. I told her what had happened, and the look on her face turned to horror. We immediately went to security. The cameras showed the man leaving the store minutes after I had confronted him. They tried to zoom in on his face, but the hood obscured most of his features. There was no car, no license plate, just a man who had blended into the night. The police were called, and I gave my statement. They checked the footage, took descriptions, assured the mother they would keep watch. But in the end, they never found him. And the most terrifying part? When security reviewed the cameras, they couldn't find any footage of him entering the store, only leaving. I don't shop at Walmart at night anymore. I don't walk past the toy section unless I absolutely have to. And every time I hear a child laughing in an aisle, I feel that same tightness in my chest, that same deep, gut-wrenching fear. Because I know that man was waiting, watching, and if I hadn't been there that night, that little girl wouldn't have been there either. I never thought a simple trip to Walmart could turn into one of the most unsettling experiences of my life. I wasn't looking for anything special that night, just a few groceries to last the week. It was late, around 10 p.m., and the store was relatively empty aside from a few last-minute shoppers. The fluorescent lights flickered slightly, casting an artificial glow over the wide aisles. I enjoyed shopping late at night because it was quiet, peaceful, but that night, the quiet felt different. It wasn't peaceful. It was unnerving. It started in the produce section. I was picking out some apples when I felt it, the distinct sensation of someone standing too close. I turned my head slightly and saw a man just a few feet away, pretending to examine a row of bananas. He was older, maybe in his late 60s, with neatly combed gray hair and a pressed brown jacket. His clothes were a little too polished, like he was dressed for something other than a late-night grocery run. At first, I didn't think much of it, but then I noticed it. He wasn't looking at the bananas. He was looking at me. I moved to another aisle, shaking off the discomfort. I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe he had just been standing in the same spot by coincidence. But when I stopped to grab some cereal, I saw him again. This time, he was at the end of the aisle, not even pretending to shop, just standing there, watching. A cold shiver crawled up my spine. I moved to another aisle. He followed. I tested it. I took a completely unnecessary detour through the home goods section, weaving through the aisles randomly, taking turns that didn't make sense. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, he was still there. He wasn't getting closer, but he wasn't leaving either. Just keeping a steady distance, always near the end of the aisle, always watching. I felt my pulse quicken. I reached for my phone, pretending to check a text, but in reality, I was debating whether to call someone. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe he was just an old man shopping like everyone else. But my gut was telling me something different. I took a deep breath and decided to head for the checkout. If he followed me there, I'd know for sure that something was wrong. I moved quickly, grabbing a few last-minute things so I wouldn't look suspicious. I made my way to an open register and started unloading my cart, keeping one eye on the store behind me. For a moment, I didn't see him. Relief started to settle in. Maybe he had left. Then, I spotted him, standing by the entrance, waiting. I forced myself to stay calm. The cashier, a tired-looking teenage boy, barely made eye contact as he scanned my groceries. I thought about telling him, but what would I say? Hey, this old guy is following me. Can you call security? It sounded ridiculous. So I kept quiet, paid for my groceries, and walked toward the exit. The automatic doors slid open. The cold night air hit my skin. I moved quickly, keys in hand, trying not to run. My car was parked near the front. I was almost there. Then I heard his voice. "Excuse me, miss." I froze. He was closer than I expected. Standing just a few feet away, that same polite smile on his face. "I saw you in the store," he said, his voice smooth. "You're a lovely young lady." My pulse spiked. I forced a stiff smile, trying to act natural. "Thanks." He took a step closer. "You shouldn't be out this late all alone," he continued. "It's dangerous." I nodded, gripping my keys tighter. "I'm fine, thank you." He tilted his head. "I can help you with your bags." "No, thank you." I reached for my car door. Then, before I could open it, he reached into his pocket. For a brief, terrifying second, I thought he was pulling out a weapon, but instead, he held up a $100 bill. "Let me pay for your groceries," he said. My stomach turned. Who carries around a loose $100 bill? Why would a stranger offer to pay for my food? Something about it felt wrong. I shook my head. "That's really not necessary." He insisted. "It's just money," he said, waving the bill slightly. "Take it." I backed up a step. "No, really. I'm fine." His smile twitched. For the first time, his expression changed. Not anger, not frustration, something worse. Like he was amused. Like he had been expecting something different. A car honked loudly somewhere behind us. That snapped me out of it. I didn't wait for him to respond. I jumped into my car, slammed the door shut, and locked it. He didn't move. He just stood there, watching as I started the engine, still holding the $100 bill. I pulled out of the parking lot as fast as I could, my hands shaking against the wheel. I glanced in the rearview mirror. He was still standing there, the bill fluttering slightly in the breeze. And then, he smiled. I didn't go straight home. I drove around for a while, making sure I wasn't being followed. I checked every stoplight, every turn. Finally, after nearly an hour, I pulled into my driveway. My stomach was still twisted in knots, but at least I was safe. Or so I thought, because the next time I went to Walmart, he was there, standing near the entrance, holding a $100 bill. And when he saw me, he smiled, like he had been waiting. I had worked the night shift at Walmart for almost a year, and by that point, I thought I had seen it all. Drunk customers stumbling through the aisles, couples having loud arguments near the self-checkout, even the occasional shoplifter trying to sneak something out under their coat. But nothing, not even the weirdest encounters I'd had, compared to what happened that night. And even now, years later, I still can't explain it. It was just past midnight, and the store was practically dead. I worked stocking shelves in the grocery section, which meant a lot of late nights, especially when big shipments arrived. The aisles were quiet except for the occasional crackle of the store's intercom and the hum of the refrigerators in the frozen food section. I had just finished refilling a display of canned goods when I felt it, that strange, heavy sensation of being watched. At first, I ignored it. Customers lingered sometimes, especially at night when there wasn't much activity. But then, I glanced up, and I saw him. He stood at the end of the aisle, completely still, a man in a black ski mask. At first, I thought maybe it was just cold outside and he hadn't bothered taking it off. But as I watched him, something about the way he stood there, motionless, sent a shiver up my spine. He wasn't pretending to browse. He wasn't looking at anything on the shelves. He was just staring directly at me. I cleared my throat and looked away, trying to focus on my work. Maybe he was just waiting for me to move so he could grab something. Maybe I was overthinking it. I busied myself with stacking the last few cans, then grabbed my empty stocking cart and turned down another aisle. But as soon as I stepped into the next section, I saw him again. This time, he was closer, still not moving, still watching, and in his hand, he was holding a can of beans. I forced a polite smile. "Can I help you find something?" He didn't respond, didn't move, didn't blink. I waited, the silence between us stretching out too long. Then, finally, he tilted his head just slightly and murmured, "These are good." His voice was flat, emotionless, like he wasn't talking to me, like he was just saying words. I nodded awkwardly. "Yeah, I guess so." I turned and walked away, pushing my cart toward the back of the store where the stockroom was. When I glanced over my shoulder, he was gone. I tried to shake it off, but something about the interaction left me uneasy. I went into the stockroom, trying to focus on my next task, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. Something about him just felt wrong. Why was he standing so still? Why had he been watching me? And why was he holding that same can of beans? After a few minutes, I convinced myself I was being paranoid. The guy had probably just been messing with me. Maybe a weird prank or something. But then, I saw him again. When I stepped back onto the floor, there he was, standing at the very end of the next aisle over, perfectly still, still holding the same can of beans. A cold chill crept up my spine. He wasn't moving toward checkout. He wasn't doing anything. Just standing, watching, waiting. At this point, my nerves were shot. I pulled out my store radio and clicked it on. Hey, has anyone noticed a guy in a ski mask walking around? A crackle of static. Then, my coworker, Chris, answered. Huh? No, man. What are you talking about? I glanced back toward the aisle. He was gone. I sucked in a deep breath. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe I was just overtired. But I didn't want to take any chances. I walked up to the front of the store, scanning the area near checkout. No sign of him. No ski mask. Nothing. All right, I muttered into my radio. Never mind. And then, the power went out. For a split second, the entire store was plunged into darkness. The hum of the refrigerators stopped. The overhead music cut out. The security cameras died. The only light came from the emergency exit signs, their dim red glow barely illuminating the aisles. And in that faint, flickering glow, I saw him. He was closer than ever now, standing in the center of the aisle just a few feet away. The ski mask covered his face, but I knew he was still staring right at me. And in his hand, the same can of beans. He raised it slowly, so slowly it made my skin crawl. And then, in that same flat, emotionless voice, he whispered, "These are good." I ran. I didn't think, didn't check to see if he followed. I just sprinted toward the break room, toward the employee exit. Chris nearly crashed into me as I barreled through the door. Whoa, dude. What the hell? Did you see him? I gasped, my heart pounding. See who? I turned back, expecting him to be there. But the aisle was empty. The power flickered back on a few minutes later. The security footage? Completely erased. There was no sign of the man in the ski mask. No proof he had ever been there. But when I went back to the canned goods aisle, something was waiting for me. A single can of beans, placed perfectly in the center of the floor, like he had left it just for me. I quit that job 2 weeks later. I never saw him again, but sometimes, when I walk through a grocery store, I still find myself glancing at the canned goods aisle. And whenever I see a can of beans sitting alone on a shelf, I feel that same chill crawl up my spine, like he's still watching, like he's waiting to return. Late-night Walmart runs had become a part of my routine. Something about shopping at night made things easier. No crowds, no screaming kids, no long checkout lines. Just a mostly empty store, dim overhead lighting, and a quiet parking lot. That night was no different. Or at least, I thought it wasn't. I was only planning to grab a few things. Some snacks, bottled water, and batteries for my TV remote. I was in and out in less than 20 minutes. As I walked toward my car, the air was cold, still, and just a little too quiet. I had parked close to the store, under one of the dimly flickering streetlights. The lot was nearly empty, with only a few scattered cars. I clicked my key fob, unlocking the driver's side door. And that's when I heard it. "Hey man, wait up." I froze. The voice was close, too close, like whoever had spoken had been watching me. I turned my head slightly and saw a man standing just a few feet away. He looked to be in his early 40s, with greasy hair tucked under a baseball cap and a jacket that was too thin for the cold. His hands were shoved into his pockets, his shoulders slightly hunched. "Sorry to bother you," he said, his voice casual, but something about his tone put me on edge. "My car broke down a few blocks away. My phone's dead. Think you could give me a ride?" Everything inside me tensed. Something was off. I scanned the parking lot again. Still empty. No security. No other people. My grip tightened on my grocery bag. "Sorry, man," I said, forcing a polite tone. "I'm heading the other way." The man didn't move. Didn't even blink. Instead, he smiled. A slow, strange, unnatural smile. "Oh, come on," he said, tilting his head. "It's just a few blocks. You look like a nice guy." My stomach turned. I shook my head and reached for my car door. Then, his smile vanished. For a long moment, he just stared at me. His expression had changed completely, like flipping a switch. Gone was the fake friendliness, the forced charm. Now, he just looked angry. "You sure?" he asked, his voice lower. I didn't answer, didn't make eye contact. I just got in, locked the doors, and started the engine. The man didn't move, didn't step away. He just stood there, watching. I threw the car into reverse, backing out quickly. My hands were shaking, my heart hammering. I didn't care if I looked paranoid. I just needed to get away. As I pulled out of the lot, I glanced in the rearview mirror. He was still standing there, still watching. And then, he raised his hand and waved. I turned onto the main road, driving faster than I should have. I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see his figure appear in the back seat or his car pulling up behind me. But the road was empty. After a few blocks, I started to relax. Maybe he was just some weird guy looking for a ride. Maybe I was overreacting. I exhaled, shaking my head. Almost home. Then, I heard it. A soft click from the passenger seat. My breath caught in my throat. I turned my head, and my blood went ice cold. He was in my car, sitting perfectly still in the passenger seat, smiling, like he had been there the entire time. I nearly swerved off the road. I didn't scream. I couldn't. My breath was trapped in my chest, my mind racing in sheer panic. "How?" I gasped. He tilted his head slightly. "You sure you can't give me a ride?" His voice was too calm, too controlled. I didn't answer. I slammed my foot on the gas. The car shot forward, my tires screeching against the pavement. My hands clenched the wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I didn't dare look at him again. I couldn't. Every instinct told me that if I acknowledged him, if I reacted, something would go very, very wrong. I focused on the road. My house wasn't far. If I could just... Then, I heard it. A quiet, rhythmic tapping on the dashboard. Tap, tap, tap. Slow, deliberate. I squeezed my eyes shut for half a second, trying to block out the sound. This isn't real. This isn't real. Then, the tapping stopped. I opened my eyes. The seat was empty. The man was gone. No trace of him. The door hadn't opened. The car hadn't stopped. He had just vanished. I slammed on the brakes, my car skidding to a stop in the middle of the road. My chest was heaving, my entire body trembling. I turned on the interior light, frantically checking the seat, the back seat, the floor. Nothing. Like he had never been there at all. But he had. I knew he had. I didn't go straight home. I drove around for nearly an hour, making sure no one, nothing, was following me. Finally, when I felt like I couldn't take it anymore, I pulled into my driveway and sat there for a long time, just staring at the empty passenger seat. It felt wrong, like someone had been sitting there for hours, like the seat still held their weight. That night, I barely slept. Every creak, every distant sound made my pulse spike. For weeks, I was terrified to drive at night. And even now, when I get into my car alone, I always check the passenger seat, because I still don't know how he got in. And I still don't know if he ever really left.